2, 1.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Agnieszka Otwinowska-Kasztelanic, and on behalf of the University of Warsaw Excellence Initiative, I have the pleasure to chair the series of 6 lectures entitled Current Trends in Multilingualism Research. Our today's guest is Jean-Marc Dewaele, who is Professor of Applied Linguistics and Multilingualism at Birkbeck, University of London. He's the he's the director of the Center for Multilingual and Multicultural Research and the director of the PhD program there. Jean-Marc Dewaele studies emotions, such as enjoyment and anxiety, within the context of language learning classrooms. His research also focuses on the linguistic, pragmatic, and sociocultural challenges that multilinguals face in communicating and recognizing emotions in different contexts. Together with Dr. Beverly Costa, a psychotherapist, they found that therapists around the world do not know enough about the complex relationships between language, emotion, and identity among their multilingual and multicultural clients. For those studies, they won the Equality and Diversity Research Award from the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy. Professor Dewaele is a truly prolific writer. He has published widely on individual differences in second language acquisition and multilingualism, and he is the author and co-author of over 160 research papers, over 70 book chapters, and 7 books. Jean-Marc Dewaele has also worked as editor of several renowned journals, including the International Journal of Bilingualism, International Journal of Bilingual Education and Bilingualism, where he was general editor until 2018, and Journal of Multilingual and Multicultural Development, where he has been general editor since 2019. He is former president of the European Second Language Association, EUROSLA, and former president of the International Association of Multilingualism. Jean-Marc, it's a pleasure to welcome you, and it's over to you right now.
Well, thank you very much, Aga, for introducing me, for inviting me. I like the modern way that we communicate with each other around the world. I would like to explain first why I am interested in this topic of emotions. I remember starting to learn English at the age of 14 in school, and thinking that English was in fact pretty difficult, especially the grammar, and then remembering that huge vocabulary, and then pronunciation, the TH was a particular challenge for me. Then trying to remember where to put the stress on words, and the role of intonation to communicate different things in English. So it took me a while before I realized that, in fact, it was even much more difficult than I thought it was. And I came to that realization when I joined the French department at Birkbeck in 1994. And I sat in one of my first staff meetings. They happened in English. And suddenly I realized that although I was understanding all the words, I wasn't in fact understanding what was being communicated. I didn't seem to be able to read between the stiff upper lips of my distinguished colleagues. I also realized later that in fact the English I had been exposed to until then was typically English from newspapers or from novels or from the television journal, typically situations where I was not expected to read between the lines, and where there was no clear implicature in what was being said. Whereas in staff meeting, what is being said is really that people want you to do things that they don't want to do themselves. And they have their own rules of communication. And so I quite naively proposed to update the admissions procedure and introducing a computerized test to test applicants' level in French. And my colleagues nodded, and I explained that it wasn't too hard and it would save us a lot of energy. And the head of department said, interesting. And I thought, right, okay, interesting. That's a positive word. So it means my colleagues agree. So after the meeting, I asked the head of department, so when can I implement this new system? And he says, oh, no, that's not something we are gonna do. I said, well, didn't you say that it was an interesting proposal and hence that you accepted? Oh no, I said, interesting. And he turned his back on me and walked away. And I realized, my God, so the word interesting that I thought was a positive word, in fact means the opposite in this polite context. What is it that I didn't get? And I realized that I hadn't quite reached my ultimate linguistic destination in English, that my socio-pragmatic skills were still lacking, that I didn't quite get what emotions were being politely communicated. And I went through a silent period after that. And then I started to speak French with them, which put them on the back foot. And I was better able to control meaning making in French, and their French was good. And then from then on, in fact, we started code switching quite a lot during staff meetings. So that's how I got interested in this specific aspect of social pragmatic and pragmatic competence, which is traditionally defined as the social perceptions that underlie participants' interpretation and performance of communicative actions. And obviously, pragmatic competence is more specifically linguistic. It's the knowledge of the linguistic resources available in a language to realize particular elocutions, also the knowledge of sequential aspects of speech acts. So in what sequence do you say certain things? And the knowledge of appropriate contextual use of the language's linguistic resources. So it is typically the very last thing that foreign language learners learn, and they typically only learn it once they are involved in authentic communications with users of that language. Since I'm talking about emotions, it's also crucial for me to define what I understand by emotions. And I'm not following the so-called universal approach on emotion by Ekman, but rather the integrative constructionist approach, where emotions are seen as non-specific constructions of the mind that are shaped in the course of socialization. That is particularly interesting for me, or relevant, because I'm interested in how multilinguals acquire foreign languages, foreign cultures. So their emotions are also shaped through the process of acculturation into a new culture. So the basic idea of this theory is that the only universal thing about emotions is that they have two core dimensions, namely valence, going from positive to negative, and arousal, going from passive to active. So the crucial idea is that emotions are not universal entities, just instances that people construct based on past emotional experiences and predictions. And it means that emotions have no unique fingerprint. It means that somebody who smiles is not necessarily happy. Someone who frowns isn't necessarily unhappy, and has that, and also that the same person may express the same emotion in very different ways depending on the context and the amount of alcohol they have had. Here are 3 books on emotions and multilingualism. The first one by Aneta Pavlenko that came out in 2005. It's a book that uses data that Aneta and I collected between 2001, 2003 with the Bilingualism and Emotion questionnaire, and I will talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The second book there is mine, came out in 2010, and you may see in the background there on the wall, the cover of the book is in fact an auto-portrait or self-portrait of my maternal grandfather from 1935. And he was a passionate, emotional, bilingual, and hence I thought it would be perfectly appropriate to have him on the cover of the book. And Palgrave Macmillan were extra happy because it meant they didn't have to pay anyone copyright for the use of the picture. The third book, more recent, by my colleague Pia Resnick at University of Vienna, who also adapted the Bilingualism and Emotion questionnaire for her study on emotions. Now, communicating emotions is really important and really, really hard because it is fundamental to our mental health, I would say. And this psychologist, Fussell, an American, wasn't thinking about multilingualism at all, says that how well we are able to express our emotions are really crucial to interpersonal relationships and well-being. Meaning that as a multilingual, if you have to express how you feel in a language in which you don't have total control or you don't have total mastery, may in fact impact your mental health. And this is in fact something that is confirmed in research on study abroad that shows that at least at the start of the study abroad, students sometimes struggle because they can't be quite as sophisticated as they used to be back home. So emotions present a sociopragmatic challenge. It's hard to know how to express an emotion appropriately. And the answer is that it really depends on multiple factors. The place, so what country are you in? What region? Are you in a pub? Your interlocutors, what's their age? Is there an age difference between you and your interlocutor? What about gender, social distance, even topic? And I quite like this quote by Zheng Dao Ye, who married an Australian and followed him to Australia, where she felt that Australians were using terms of endearment and emotion vocabulary much too frequently, and that she herself resisted in that use of emotion words, and explaining that as a Chinese, she prefers to express her emotions in an implicit way, without words. And so it is a bit hard for a Chinese to be suddenly in an environment where everybody uses emotional vocabulary. And I imagine that it must be who settle in China and realize that their overt and explicit expression of emotion may come across as inappropriate by their Chinese interlocutors. So how do we recognize emotions in the first or in the foreign language? Obviously, we listen to verbal cues, we listen to words. We also pay special attention to vocal cues, pitch, rhythm, timbre, speaking rate, intensity, intonational contours, and we pay attention to the face of the speaker because obviously that conveys crucial emotional information. Now, usually these cues are congruent. In some cases, they aren't, and that can make it quite difficult. So if you hear somebody who seems to be unhappy, but their face doesn't show any unhappiness to you, then you start wondering whether you are getting it. And so the two books that I mentioned earlier, by Aneta and myself, we collected data from 1,564 multilinguals from around the world. I think it was probably the biggest and earliest online questionnaire in multilingualism and applied linguistics research. We were particularly interested in how multilinguals, how they perceive their different languages, what their language preferences were for the communication of feelings, anger, but also for swearing, emotional force of their different languages, linked to self-perceived proficiency and foreign language anxiety. And the pattern that we found for all our variables was that the first language was typically preferred for communication of emotion. And the first language was typically also felt to be more powerful than languages and acquired later in life. Anita was really interested in trying to understand why we found that pattern, and so she digged into the literature, and the most I would say the best possible explanation would be linked to the fact that the first language is acquired in a very different way from the first language, from the foreign language. So the first language, you learn it through affective linguistic conditioning as a child. Limbic system emotional memory are involved, meaning that you do remember your mom yelling at you for using a swear word in the kitchen, and feeling embarrassed about it and linking it to the smell of the pancakes she was making at the time, or the sound of her voice as she yelled at you. So it has deep multimodal roots. In contrast, languages learned later in life, foreign languages, typically rely on declarative memory rather than implicit memory. They typically feel more detached because they are typically learned in a foreign language classroom where you don't have that rich multimodality in the acquisition of new emotion words and concepts. That said, we had participants in our study that reported that in fact the foreign language was the language that was emotionally dominant for them because they had fallen in love in that language. And they hadn't fallen in love in their first language. Hence, for them, the language of love was the foreign language. So the conclusion is that the stronger emotionality of the first language is not a law of nature. So what were the sources of individual variation then? Well, broadly, it was linked to participants' linguistic history, their present language use, and a number of socio-biographical variables. So one relevant independent variable was the age at which participants had started learning a foreign language. So the early onset was typically linked with high levels of emotional resonance of that language. Context of acquisition. So people who had learned a foreign language in a classroom reported lower levels of emotionality of that language than those who had learned a language naturalistically, or by a combination of formal learning and authentic use of the language. And then, of course, the more you use a foreign language, the stronger you are socialized in that language, and the larger the size of your network in that foreign language, also the more likely you were to choose that language to express your emotions. So here was a typical pattern of what we found. So our participants, they significantly prefer to use their first language for swearing. The foreign languages were used significantly less frequently, though they did report that sometimes they might prefer to swear in a foreign language because it wouldn't be perceived as being as bad as swearing in their first language by fellow first language users. And the same pattern for the emotional force of swear words. So people felt that the swear words in their first language were much more powerful than the equivalents in languages that they had acquired later in life. And this pattern was confirmed in research by cognitive psychologists Catherine Harris from Boston University, who used the lie detector technology, measuring skin conductance, and her Turkish-English bilinguals who were psychology students, they reacted physically when they heard reprimands and taboo words in their Turkish in first language. They reacted more strongly than when they heard the equivalents in English of these same words. So it's clear that they that somehow the reprimands and taboo words were more embodied in their first language compared to their second language. And also in a very recent paper that came out just a couple of weeks ago with former PhD students of mine and a visiting postdoc, Reni Mavru, we looked at differences in emotional reactions of Greek, Hungarian, and British users of English as they watched television and films in English. And we constructed a composite measure that we labeled self-reported emotional reactions. And it had 4 different items. How frequently do you feel emotional when watching the news in English? The same for films. How frequently do you laugh when watching a funny film in English? And how much do you trust a news report in English? So you see, it has both frequency and intensity, includes funniness and trust. And as you see, the graph on the left, we found the expected pattern comparing the first and foreign language users, with the first language users scoring significantly higher than the foreign language users for emotional reactions. But then we also discovered unexpected differences between our Greek and Hungarian foreign language users of English. And we were quite surprised by that. And we realized that, in fact, it could be linked to the history of English in both countries. And it could be linked to the fact that in Greece, the foreign language education, EFL teaching has traditionally been really good with highly qualified teachers. Also in Greece, there is a tradition of showing foreign films in the original version on television with subtitles. However, in Hungary, teachers of English are very often people who used to teach Russian before the fall of the wall. And they converted to teaching English, so they may not have been quite as good in English. And Hungary has a history of dubbing films, foreign films on television. So it means that Hungarians are less likely to see English news or films in the authentic version, which means it's harder for them to connect the verbal and non-verbal and facial cues about emotion than the Greeks. So our conclusion was that watching television, watching films in a foreign language is a good way to pick up the sociopragmatics of emotion. And also an implication is that we cannot assume that any group of foreign language user will score lower than any group of L1 users on emotional reactions. So that is an important caveat, because until now, most research did exactly that. One group of L1 users, one group of LX users, and test, check whether they differed or not. So in feedback I reported in my book, a lot of participants noted that it is easy for them to use taboo words in a foreign language because it comes out easily, but it may have more effect than they think it should have. Theodora also, who talked about, oh, I can use the F word in English easily, but I don't really hear just how bad and how strong that word is. And so here is a hilarious picture of sales in Japan. It's hard to imagine something like that at Harrods in London after Christmas. The fucking is absolutely taboo in writing, really. So you would never advertise sales using that word. It also took me a long time before I learned what the C word means in English, because I did hear about the C word, but I had no idea what it actually was until I asked a colleague of mine, Malcolm, in the department, and I said, Malcolm, you know, what would be the worst swear word in the English language? And he said, oh, that would be the C word. I said, well, Malcolm, I've heard about the C word, but I have no idea what it is. So tell me, what is this C word? I said, oh, I couldn't possibly tell you, but I can spell it out for you. It is C-U-N-T. And I said, cunt? He jumped and he said, oh, you can't say that word. I said, oh, really? That powerful? How funny, because, you know, the cognate in French and Dutch isn't that bad, really. So why is it that bad in English? And the answer is that nobody knows. Nobody knows why particular swear words are particularly offensive in certain languages and not in others. And so in this data set, I collected data from about a similar number of first and foreign language users of English, asked them to rate 30 swear words, and there was one word only where the first language users rated the understanding of the meaning significantly higher than the LX users, also rated the offensiveness as being higher than the foreign language users, and also reported using it slightly more, significantly more, though infrequently, than the LX users. And so the word is in fact so explosive because it is so offensive and because it isn't used that much. So the word fuck is used much more frequently, and though it is banned on the BBC, it's probably not gonna upset the interlocutor as much as the word cunt. So I don't want you to think that I'm only interested in smut and taboo. I'm also interested in the words of love, and hence in a study I did with the former master students, we looked at data from 429 participants in cross-cultural couples. We asked them whether it was hard for them to express their emotions in a foreign language. A third said, oh, no, no difficulty at all. But about half of them said, well, yeah, there are some constraints because I can't quite express myself as easily in a foreign language, and this foreign language doesn't have the resonance for me. It was linked also for a minority to feeling inauthentic in their relationship. It was also linked to their personality, and hence participants who were closer to the emotional stability end of the dimension and further away from the neurotic end of the dimensions, they experienced fewer fears about loss of intensity in communication of emotion. They also typically didn't feel that they were not genuine in their interaction with their partner. We were surprised to find that females were more likely to adopt the partner's language. And in interviews, we realized that about half of them focused on constraints of the foreign language, yet 25% reported the opposite, namely emotional liberation in being able to talk about their emotions in a foreign language. And here are some examples. Participants reporting conceptual problems like I love you is less meaningful and serious than ich liebe dich in German. Others complained about struggling with limited vocabulary, like romantic feelings. I spoke more in Japanese, but it was more difficult at times because of the lack of emotional vocabulary rather than emotional connection. And then a happy Alex user, we said, you know, lingua franca was English, but sex was more important than language. And then the constraints that using a foreign language, things don't sound quite as serious. They sound like a joke, and hence expressing your love for a partner, if it sounds like a joke, it's not good. And then those who thought it was in fact a liberation, it's easier to say I love you in English than in Swedish. It's not as deep. We also discovered that for most participants, 50% of the participants reported that if they had problems, those problems had disappeared in a matter of months. Yet, as you see, 10% said that it had taken at least a year, and another 10% said that in fact it had taken them years to communicate their emotions properly with their partner. In a follow-up study specifically on the pragmatics, I found some interesting issues, namely the fact that participants, like this female participant, said that she couldn't be subtle enough in communicating her emotions. She felt that she was blunt, expressing them in English with her partner. And also another Japanese participant complained that her partner wasn't able to read her silence, that rather than using emotion words to express anger, she was angrily silent. And yet it seemed it took him a while before getting it. Then in the B&Q, we also had a couple of items on code switching, specifically asking whether people switch, if they switched depending on their interlocutor and depending on the topic. And we did find that, in fact, there is a clear interlocutor effect. So people, multilinguals, code switch most frequently with their friends, which makes perfect sense because their friends know what languages they have in common. Slightly less so with colleagues, still less with strangers, and really infrequently in public appearances. It also depended on the topic. So people were more likely to code switch when talking about emotional matters and personal matters, but much less when talking about emotionally neutral matters. The direction of the code switching was typically from the foreign language to the first language in emotional situations, like Evie reports about her partner who is Moroccan, has Berber as a first language. They argue in Dutch, but sometimes he switches to Berber and doesn't even seem to be aware of it. And Cristina, who has Catalan as a first language, but is married to a German, explains that when it gets really critical, she would use Catalan to swear in. And I think it may be linked to the fact that when you get really emotional and you need to swear, that's a cathartic function of the language, that you need to get rid of these strong emotions quickly, and that if you can't verbalize it quickly enough, it kind of spills over, and you may, because there is a bottleneck of, you know, what's the gender of that word? How do I pronounce that word? It's too much effort. So the switch to the first language would be explained. And then Vali made a really interesting comment about code switching to English a lot when she was seeing a psychologist in Greece. So she switched from Greek to English, and she said, well, maybe, in fact, it may have been a distancing strategy, because I was trying to figure out what to do with my life. And I thought, oh, that's a great quote. I hadn't thought about that at the time. And I was lucky that Beverly Costa read the book and picked up on that very quote and contacted me and said, you know, I am a psychotherapist, but we need to do research on this because this is really, really relevant. And so we collected data from therapists, 101, of which 19 were monolingual. We used a mixed methods approach, an online questionnaire with closed questions, and then interviews with a monolingual and 2 multilingual therapists. We discovered that multilingual therapists were better at attuning with their clients, whereas monolingual therapists were more likely to collude. So the interviews probed their views and tried to uncover the causes for the statistical patterns. And then the following year, we decided to focus on the views of clients and former clients. And we realized that this was in fact a burning issue for many of them, that they felt that having a multilingual therapist promoted empathy and understanding. Also, they explained that for them, their multilingualism or multiculturalism was really a crucial aspect of their self and had to be acknowledged by the therapist, and some felt frustrated if the therapist didn't take that into account. They also all agreed that language switches in therapy were typically more frequent when the emotional tone was raised, and that it could be a strategy to either zoom in on something or zoom out of something that was too painful to discuss in a language. So to conclude, communicating emotions in a foreign language is really not easy. It is much more difficult than grammar rules, yet it is a crucial aspect of sociopragmatic and sociocultural competence, and it has real-world consequences. So learners, users need to be aware of local norms to express and recognize emotions in their foreign language. Psychotherapists need to be aware that the fact that their client is able to talk about the weather with them in the psychotherapist's first language does not mean that that client is able to talk about very emotional matters in that language, that they may be, they may struggle with vocabulary issues, but they also may struggle with cultural taboos that are maybe more likely to silence them in their first language than in the foreign language. So the foreign language sometimes can be a way to avoid difficulties and trauma that happened in the first language. And I think that what we found about psychotherapists, in fact, applies equally to other people who deal with immigrants, be it policemen interviewing suspects, that being in a highly stressful situation and having to use a foreign language puts you at a disadvantage. And hence both the policeman and the psychotherapist or the doctor should be aware of that. Okay, and that is my conclusion. I would be very happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Jean-Marc, for this very, very interesting talk. And I wanted to ask the first question because I can't see any questions on the chat yet. I just wanted to ask you, what advice would you have for teachers? Because both you and I are language teachers, and do you think that emotions and affectivity matter much in the classroom, context, right? So maybe.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I think it is crucial for teachers to allow learners to express how they feel in the foreign language. Mm-hmm. I think that that's not a trivial matter, as we saw. In fact, it is a crucial matter. And I remember being very frustrated going to Spain on a summer course, and I felt that I was falling in love with a lovely Madrileñan girl. And then I realized that I lacked the way to express my feelings. You know, I could say things like te quiero, I love you, which is a bit blunt. And I realized that I did not know the sequence, in fact, how to express feelings. It's more than just words. You need to know in what sequence you say what. Do you say something about, I like your hair, I like your eyes, what is acceptable? How do you chat somebody up? It's pretty hard in your first language. It's even harder in a foreign language. And yet, you know, I'm not saying that all teachers should teach chat up lines to their students, but they would certainly get their students' attention, because students are interested in that, in the sense that how expressing how they feel is really, really important, especially when you're a teenager. So yes, I think that teachers should pay attention to that. I think that teachers should also be aware that their students probably know languages that they don't know, and that it is really good to invite them to compare what is said in the language that the teacher is teaching, how that compares to the other languages that the students know. And I think it would be a crucial way into a better understanding of cultural and linguistic diversity. And in fact, also of respect that, you know, the way we do it in this language is just one way, but it could be done in other ways. And that's what makes life so interesting, right?
Thank you. We have some questions already. So the first question comes from Martin Testa, and he says the following: I'm curious about your results about females adopting their partner's language. Were all the females in your study L1 speakers of less mainstream languages who adopted to their partner's leading language, for example, English, Spanish, Chinese, or maybe not?
Yeah, I was a bit shocked by that result. Which is why I reported it also. There was no clear linguistic pattern. So we had people with a large range of different languages, both first languages and foreign languages. So it was not linked to any specific linguistic profile. And we also had, I must say, a majority of female participants in the sample. So any questionnaire on emotions, we always get 75% female participants, only 25% male participants. So I need to point that out.
I think that I might have an explanation for that. Maybe women are just more empathetic, and that's why they tend to align with the partner more.
That's a possibility. Yeah.
Okay, we have the next question from Lube. Do you think that your observations also have an impact on international politics, discussions in English, which is not the first language, or when interpreters need to match the emotional tone of in real-time translations? Could there be further effects on decision-making, for instance?
Yes.
Interesting question.
Yes, thank you for that question. There is a whole new branch of psychology that focuses on the so-called foreign language effect. And in fact, it is funny because they refer to my work and Aneta's work as foundation of their research. So what they find is that decision-making in a foreign language is typically more detached, more utilitarian, less emotional, and hence multilinguals are more likely to make emotional decisions in their first language, less so in their foreign language. That's the kind of pattern that seems to emerge. And the classic example of that is the footbridge dilemma. I don't know whether you have heard of this. It's a thought experiment. So the scenario is as follows. You have to imagine yourself, you are standing next to a fat man on a bridge, and you see a train coming down the rail, and you notice that there are 5 children attached to the rails, and they will be killed if somehow you don't manage to stop the train. So the question then is, would you, and it's obvious that by pushing the fat man from the bridge, you might kill the fat man, but you will save the life of 5 children. That's the dilemma. And now, faced with that dilemma, multilinguals who are asked that question in their second language are more likely to report that they would actually push the man from the bridge. Something they would not do, or to a lesser degree, if the question was asked in their first language. This has huge implications because, as you say, what if you are a general and you have to decide on a life and death situation? Do you push the button or not? Well, depending on the language in which you get the order, in fact, your decision may be different. That's a bit scary, isn't it? And the same applies for tribunals. If the judge is functioning in a first or a foreign language, and the judge or the jury has to decide on a death sentence, will you sentence somebody to death? Well, depending on the language, it could affect the outcome. So it means that languages are not just neutral tools. That in fact, languages are something that we need to be aware of, that it has implications in all kinds of directions. And then obviously through interpreters, it's not always clear to what extent then interpreters can actually carry the emotional tone of the original. And I imagine that really good interpreters can, but not everybody is equally good. So something might get lost in the translation there, and that could make a huge difference.
So, okay, then I will follow with a question about interpreters. I'm aware of some other questions on the way, but the next question will be from Małgorzata Tryuk. I have a question from an interpreter's trainer perspective. how to train interpreters, you mentioned the migration context, to deal with emotions of their clients and their own emotions.
Yes, it's a very complex question, and there is literature on this. I think the crucial part is that interpreters, like teachers, need to be able to regulate their emotions. So they cannot actually show how they feel. You know, I like to remind my students and people who are training to be teachers that the moment you get angry in a classroom, you've lost it. So you have to regulate your emotions very carefully. And the same is true for interpreters, in that they may get very upset by the stuff they hear, and they have to translate. And I imagine that it can cost, well, that it requires a huge amount of emotional labor to be translating things that they might totally disagree with or find disgusting, and yet they are there to serve the client or the therapist or the people who ask them to do the interpreting. So I would be interested in seeing more research on, you know, the physiological reactions of interpreters and how they manage not to buckle under huge emotional pressure. Especially also that interpreters in psychotherapy sessions, for example, may, if it hasn't been planned properly with the psychotherapist, there is a danger that the client might seek to establish an alliance with the interpreter against the psychotherapist, which can harm the therapy. So there are a huge amount of potential problems when you have an interpreter in the room. I mean, obviously, sometimes it is absolutely crucial and it can work out fine, but there needs to be clear preparation between the interpreter and whoever is asking for his or her services.
Okay, we have two more questions from Michał Paradowski. So the first one is as follows: may there be other factors at play, for example, normative rules and constraints that are drummed in during upbringing in L1, but much more rarely so in life when other languages are typically learned?
Yes, I think it is pretty obvious that things that happen through language, that happen to you through language in childhood, will leave a stronger impression and stronger images and memories than things that happen to you later in life. Unless obviously you grew up with multiple languages and you link these different languages to different rules of behavior and different cultural values, etc. But if you learn a foreign language later in life, I think that you may struggle more with the realization that a language is more than just a communication tool, that it is in fact linked to very often religious beliefs, cultural beliefs, ways of behaving, even that's right, so non-verbal things. And those are very often things that you are not even aware of. And the anecdote that I love to share is when I arrived in London, I realized that my colleagues thought that I was trying to shake hands too often, because Belgians are known to love to shake hands. So every day, you know, you see your friend, you shake hands, and you don't do that in the UK. So they would look at my hand and then do this, but oh no, here he is again wanting to shake hands. And then I realized, okay, don't shake hands. And then obviously when I returned to Belgium to see friends and family, then they were surprised that I wasn't trying to shake hands anymore. And they said, so what's wrong? On fait plus la bise, because there is also the pecking. You know, we do a lot of kissing in Belgium. You absolutely don't do that. Well, maybe COVID will have changed that in Belgium too now, I don't know. And the same then with the distance you stand from your interlocutor. Mm-hmm. I realized at the staff meeting that my head of department was taking a step back and I was taking a step forward. And we crossed the whole room holding a glass of wine. And I thought, what is wrong with him? Why is he walking away from me? And then it dawned on me that maybe I was invading his privacy. I was standing too close. Mm-hmm. And I realized, in fact, that in Belgium, half an arm length is okay from your interlocutor. But in the UK, it is a full arm length. You are standing at least a meter distance from your interlocutor. Any closer, and you're invading their privacy. And then a couple of years ago, I was back in Belgium at a reception and talking to an old friend of mine. And suddenly I realized that I could smell the peanuts on his breath. And I took half a step back and he took half a step forward. And then I took another half step back and he took another half step forward. And suddenly I realized, shit, I turned into a Brit. Because that's the kind of thing I never realized it until that point. Mm-hmm. that you change in ways that you don't necessarily are aware of. And that's part of socialization, foreign language socialization or acculturation into a new culture. You can't undo that just by switch of a button.
Mm-hmm. I was actually thinking that you can never learn the pragmatics and the emotionality of the language unless you have started to live in the community where the language is spoken. I was thinking about my English. I've never lived in Britain, actually. I visited Britain several times, but never lived there. So for me, English is just a working tool. It's nothing else. But my kind of intermediate German is, I feel much more affinity with that language because I lived in Germany for a year and a half, and I have some, I'm emotionally attached to that language, although it sounds very bad, right? As German does, right? But there is something that you connect to people, you connect to places, you create those mental schemata, right, which help you understand the world and understand other people, right? So that's what I thought. Okay, another interesting question from Michał Paradowski. Would you say that the same effects as those you presented hold equally for the written mode of expression, or would some only be seen in speech, not writing? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, in fact, I would say that you probably wouldn't find, well, I would bet that the effects are weaker in written language compared to oral language. That's also what Harris and her colleagues found, because she had her experiment where her Turkish-English bilinguals were either listening to the emotion words or reading them on a screen. And their reactions were much stronger when listening than when reading. So there is something to the voice that adds to the emotionality and the interpretation of emotionality. And I guess it's just that if you listen to a voice, there is more information to catch compared to the written word where there is no intonation. Yeah.
Okay, there's another question from Irene Hovanesian, I'm sorry. I'm multilingual, and I have noticed that there are sets of emotions that I prefer to express in a different language. For example, when I'm angry, I will turn to Greek. I use Armenian when I'm happy and English when enthusiastic. Do your studies show a similar trend?
Well, I would say that the answer to that is probably linked to François Grosjean's complementarity principle, namely that multilinguals may prefer different languages for specific discourse domains. So it seems that for the person who asked that question, it's not specific discourse domains, but the experience of certain emotions linked to certain languages. So it's interesting because I haven't come across that before, but it is not, I mean, I can understand the logic of it. Though I would say that these things typically also change over time. So the language preferences can change over time if you move countries, or your children grow older, or new people come into the family, or our language preferences are not absolutely stable. They can change slightly over time. And I used to say that English was my academic language, and hence was a cold, distant, detached language for me. But now, after 26 years in the UK, in fact, it is more than an academic language. It is a language in which I have heard people swear and cry and yell, and hence it has acquired emotional connotations that it didn't have at the start. So I would say that today a poem or lyrics in English can bring me to tears just as much as lyrics in French, which used to bring me to tears, or poetry in French. I seem to react more strongly to it. So it is changing over time.
Yeah. Okay. There's another question by Elżbieta Horodyska, who it's very interesting. And it's interesting for me to note that I automatically switch to my first language when talking to a dog. And you research on communicating with animals.
Yeah. No, that is absolutely that's funny, but not unusual. I think Wierzbicka talks about the fact that when she holds her grandchild, so she lives in Australia, she can use Polish baby language with her grandchild. She's unable to use English with him, despite the fact that she knows the English words to talk to a baby, but it somehow feels wrong. And the Polish comes up, despite the fact that I think the child is not necessary. I forgot now, but I don't think the child is growing up as Polish-English bilingual. But yet for her, this child can only be addressed in Polish. So I guess the dog also triggers a language preference.
Yeah, for sure. It's like, with memories of your first language and your puppy that you had when you were a child, probably, right? Okay. Exactly. Yeah. By the way, I just wanted to ask one more question. What do you think about parents who decide not to speak their native language to their child? Because you mentioned, speaking the first language to the baby, but some parents simply make decisions to, conscious decisions not to speak their native language to their child. I know that you raised your daughter multilingually, right? But this is a very special situation. You're a mixed family living in Britain, right? So
no, I think parents should not be afraid of passing on their first language. Of course, it's difficult if they have multiple first languages, because which one will they choose? Because as you said, my daughter grew up with Dutch, French, and English from birth. In fact, she also had Urdu as a fourth first language, but she lost that when she stopped going to the Pakistani childminder who used Urdu with the children. But the thing is that having intensive exposure to 4 languages did not delay her acquisition of various languages. And in fact, the fact of using both Dutch and French at home did not delay her development of English. In fact, she always had the highest scores for English at school. So this is obviously just anecdotal evidence, but it shows that a child's brain can handle multiple languages, and that in fact it has cognitive advantages rather than disadvantages. And obviously it depends on circumstances. So I'm not claiming that it would have worked equally well had Livia spoken a language that was not much appreciated in the UK. So I'm not claiming that if one of her languages had been Punjabi or Arabic, maybe she would have had negative reactions at school or by friends. And children are very sensitive to that. They have these antennas. But French, despite the fact that fewer people seem to be learning foreign languages in the UK these days, French is still a language that is taught at school. So it has positive connotations. So her friends told her, oh, how lucky you are using French with your dad. And Dutch, well, nobody in the UK has a strong opinion about Dutch. It's just a language, but it doesn't have negative associations. So had she had a different language constellation, I'm not sure that she would have kept up with all the languages. Maybe, you know, and there are cases in the literature where a child feels that language is not not social capital and will want to hide that from peers. So there is no one recipe for success in multilingual language acquisition.
Yeah, of course. But I was just thinking about, you know, those situations where parents use a language that is not their emotional language when raising children. Will that lead to some emotional problems? That was my question, basically.
Okay, I understand now. In fact, that was the case of my mother, who my father convinced her to use French with us. So only French was used in the household, despite the fact that French was my mother's second language. She was more fluent in Dutch, her first language. But my dad insisted that she should use French also with us, which we did, and her French was good enough, and you know we didn't have any emotional problems, etc. But I so regret then that I was annoying with correcting her French, because she made occasional gender errors. And then my dad was a teacher of French, and then obviously having grown up and being an early teacher myself, you know, I couldn't help myself but correcting when she made a gender error. And I regretted that afterwards, because I realized only later what kind of pressure she must have been under to be using a second language with her children in order to please my dad.
Okay, there was an interesting comment that was deleted. Okay, so let's move on then. Okay, the next one is from Breno Silva, who says, I talk to my cat in Portuguese, my first language. No, Breno, I've heard you speak Czech to your cat, actually. Breno is my PhD student, right? And he used to live in the Czech Republic for some time. Okay, but the next question is, okay, I know also from Breno, I know a couple both Poles. So the mother spoke Polish at home, the dad spoke Czech, a language he was in love with and proficient at. What do you think about this? So, you know, very many people decide to speak a language which is, you know, they like the language, they speak the language fluently, and they decide that this is the language they're going to speak to their children. Really, sometimes I find it weird.
Yeah, well, you know, everybody is free to do whatever they want. So if they feel that their mastery of the foreign language is good enough for them to communicate with their children, why not?
Okay.
And children are perfectly able to absorb multiple languages, and they are, in fact, if the input is rich enough, they are probably going to end up speaking the language better than the foreign language user family member who is using that language with them. Yeah. So that's one of the wonderful things about our ability to acquire languages. we seem to be able as young children to filter out what is wrong in the input and become better speakers or signers, because it is typically a situation when parents have a deaf child, that the parents have to learn sign language to communicate with their child. And then obviously the child also has other sources of input, but the parents' imperfect input is enough for the child to pick up sign language and end up correcting the parents for making mistakes, which is pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the crucial aspect here, so rich input, right? So it's not only about, you know, being able to say a few words, but you really have to provide the child with rich input, read books to them, show films, interact with them quite frequently. Okay, the interesting comment is back. Okay, that's a comment from Sandra Materska, who says the following: do you think this is also the case with recognizing emotions? Would it be easier for a multilingual person to recognize different emotions in others, or would it end up in a confusion?
Thank you. Excellent question. I realize that I have not included slides on that part of my research, because I have done quite a lot of research on emotion recognition in multilinguals.
I remember that, yeah.
Yes. And it turns out that, in fact, yes, bi and multilinguals tend to be better at recognizing emotions in different languages, because I think that bilingual and multilinguals are aware of the difficulties in perceiving emotions and may hence pay more attention to different cues, be it in the voice or in the face or in the words, in the words not said. Also, like my Japanese participant who complained about silence being misunderstood. So I think that bi and multilinguals do have that advantage, that they don't assume that if something doesn't fit the expected pattern, it can't be there. I think that multilinguals by nature are aware that if something is not there, maybe it's because they haven't looked hard enough, and that by investigating this a little bit further, they might in fact get an answer. I think that's really what differentiates, I would say, monolingual and multilinguals.
Okay, that was our last question, I guess. Jean-Marc, thank you very, very much for this fascinating talk. Thank you very much for answering our questions. It was a real pleasure to have you with us. And let me just remind the listeners that we're going to have yet another lecture on multilingualism in 2 weeks' time on the 15th of April, and that will be Professor Iasones Enos from the Basque Country talking about multilingualism and education. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.